Have you ever, looked at a new law or maybe a sweeping new regulation coming down from the state or even just a massive new company policy rolled out by HR and thought to yourself, this is obviously going to backfire?
Oh, absolutely. It's that sinking feeling where you aren't just skeptical, but you can actually see the structural flaw right there in front of you.
Right. You look at the rules they've laid out
Yeah.
and you can map out step by step how people are going to game the system right from day one.
You read the text and you just know, basically in your bones, that it's going to create the exact opposite behavior of what the authors claim they want.
And then sure enough, like a few years later, the whole thing just crashes and burns. The initiative fails. The budget blows up. People are miserable.
And the politicians or executives who wrote it act incredibly surprised. I mean, they hold these press conferences and call it an unforeseeable act of God, or they blame some external factor that they claim nobody could have predicted.
When the reality is that the failure was completely foreseeable.
Totally. The disaster was practically guaranteed by the structure of the rules they themselves wrote.
Okay, let's unpack this, because that feeling, that incredibly frustrating experience of watching a slow-motion car crash that the people in charge seem totally blind to, is exactly what we are exploring today.
Yeah, it's a very common frustration.
So we are doing a deep dive into a really compelling piece of work by Elias Kunis called The Mechanism Analysis.
It's a fascinating text.
It really is. Kunis proposes a concept that I think shifts how we understand governance from the ground up. He makes the argument that every substantive law isn't just a document.
Right, because we tend to think of laws as just text on a page, or like a declaration of our society's good intentions.
Exactly. But Kunis says no. A law is a causal machine.
A causal machine. It alters the payoffs in people's lives. It shifts the boundary conditions of what is possible, what is expensive, and what is cheap.
It basically opens up new channels for people to respond to pressure.
Yeah, and when a legislature passes a law, they are effectively installing a piece of autonomous, causal machinery directly into the living tissue of society.
Which is a wild way to think about it. And the massive blind spot in modern governance that Kunis points out is that we have absolutely no standard document or procedure that tests whether that causal machinery actually works before we turn it on.
None. We have mountains of paperwork that get filed before a major bill is passed, but nothing that does that specific job.
I mean, if you look at any major legislative push, there are thousands of pages generated. We have documents that test if a law is constitutional. We have massive spreadsheets that guess how much a law will cost over the next 10 years.
But we do not have a standard test bench that asks the single most consequential engineering question, which is, what does this new mechanism actually make rational for the next person to do?
Right. So our mission today for this deep dive is to explore this missing artifact. Kunis is offering a blueprint for testing the causal machinery of legislation before it gets enacted.
And it really acts as an engineering test bench for society. I want to stress that this isn't some abstract academic theory meant to be debated in a philosophy seminar.
It's practical.
Very. It's a highly structured, rigorous methodology for preventing these catastrophic, slow-motion institutional failures we see all around us.
We are essentially talking about an upgrade to the operating system of how laws are drafted, vetted, and deployed.
Exactly.
So to really grasp the gravity of this missing piece, we have to look at the sheer volume of oversight that already exists. I mean, it's not like politicians just write a law on a napkin and pass it.
No, not at all. The modern legislative pipeline is incredibly dense.
If you want to pass a bill, you are running it through a massive, highly formalized apparatus.
You have the legal drafting committees, you have constitutional review to ensure it doesn't violate fundamental rights, you have fiscal scoring from budget offices.
Regulatory impact assessments, expert testimony, committee hearings, ministerial briefings. The level of administrative friction is just enormous.
It is. But through all those thousands of pages and hours of testimony, Kunis points out that the core question of human behavior and causal output is completely ignored.
The existing infrastructure basically treats legislation as text, as stated intent, and as a static reallocation of funds.
Right. It doesn't treat it as a machine that will provoke a predictable reaction.
So Kunis walks through the adjacent documents, the
Yeah.
paperwork we do currently mandate, to show why they completely missed the mark. Let's walk through those, because it's really illuminating to realize what we're actually measuring right now versus what we assume we're measuring.
I agree. Let's start with constitutional review.
Okay, constitutional review. That's the bedrock of any legal system, right?
It is. It tests whether a proposed law violates higher legal norms. A Supreme Court or constitutional committee will look at a bill and ask, does it infringe on fundamental human rights?
Or does it overstep jurisdictional limits?
Exactly. Does it respect due process? But constitutional review entirely ignores causal output.
Wait, really? Entirely?
Entirely. A law can be perfectly constitutional, meticulously respecting every legal norm, and still be a completely dysfunctional machine that achieves absolutely nothing of what it set out to do.
Or worse, actively harms the people it was meant to help.
Right, because legal coherence is not the same thing as mechanical functionality.
That makes a lot of sense. Just because a machine is built using legally sourced parts doesn't mean the machine actually turns on.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so then we have fiscal scoring and official forecasts. In the U.S., this is the Congressional Budget Office, the CBO.
Yeah.
In the U.K., it's the Office for Budget Responsibility.
These offices are incredibly powerful.
And they do try to model behavior, don't they? I mean, if they look at a tax increase, they don't just multiply the new rate by the current revenue. They model the fact that some people will work less or hide their money, right?
They do. They employ sophisticated dynamic behavioral modeling for things like labor supply responses, capital shifting, and gaming the tax base.
That's what's the problem.
The limitation is that their primary ledger is strictly fiscal. They are only looking at money.
I see.
They do not measure the consumption of non-financial resources. They aren't tasked with tracking what happens to the institutional trust of a community or the administrative capacity of a government agency.
Or the actual qualitative output of a public service.
Exactly. So if a new law saves the government $1 billion, but does so by completely burning out the healthcare workforce and destroying public trust in hospitals, the fiscal score from the budget office might still look fantastic.
The spreadsheet will show a green, balanced budget, completely ignoring the structural collapse happening just off the balance sheet.
Precisely.
Wow. Okay, that brings us to regulatory impact assessments, or RIAs. We hear about these all the time, especially in places with massive regulatory bodies.
Like the European Union with the Regulatory Scrutiny Board, or the U.S. with OIRA, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs.
People often think these are the bodies that test if a law works.
They do test things, but their center of gravity is heavily focused on expected costs, expected benefits, and administrative burdens on small businesses.
And comparing different policy alternatives, right?
Yes, but what they typically lack is adversarial testing of the behavioral routes.
What does that mean exactly?
It means they don't rigorously map out whether the mechanism will actually route human and institutional behavior through the intended channels. They tend to assume that if you tell an industry to do something, the industry will do it.
And then they just calculate the cost of that compliance.
Exactly. They rarely map out the scenario where the industry finds a cheaper, completely unmodeled exit strategy that bypasses the regulation entirely.
I see. Then we have the audit offices. The Government Accountability Office in the U.S., the European Court of Auditors. These are the watchdogs.
The ones who publish those massive, scathing reports about government waste and failed programs.
Right, so they catch the failures.
They absolutely catch failures. The issue is purely temporal.
Temporal. Because they come in after the fact.
Yes. Audit offices are entirely retrospective. By the time an audit office publishes a report detailing a massive mechanism failure, that broken machine has been running in the real world for 3, 5, or 10 years.
Billions of dollars have been spent, human lives have been impacted, and the damage is already locked in.
It's too late to prevent the crash.
Okay, so what about the outside world? Think tanks, university research centers, academic networks. These people write brilliant, rigorous critiques, predicting why certain laws will fail before they are passed.
They do produce phenomenal structural critiques. The problem Kunis identifies here is a lack of what he calls procedural attachment.
Meaning they aren't part of the official process.
Exactly. Think tanks exist outside the formal legislative pipeline. They can publish a brilliant white paper detailing exactly why a bill will collapse, but they have no formal lever to force the legislature to actually read it.
Let alone bind the politicians into a loop where they have to address the critique on the record.
Right. So the analysis simply sits on a shelf. It can be easily ignored, or it just gets selectively weaponized by whichever political faction finds it convenient for their current talking points.
I want to try an analogy here to make sure I'm visualizing the gap Kunis is pointing out.
Go for it.
Imagine a massive aerospace company is building a brand new passenger jet. The constitutional review is like the legal department signing off on a massive stack of documents, proving that all the aluminum, the titanium, and the wiring were legally sourced and imported according to trade laws.
Okay, I like this.
The fiscal scoring is the accounting department's spreadsheet showing that the entire project, from design to manufacturing, stayed perfectly under budget.
Yep.
The audit office is a highly trained team of crash investigators standing by on the runway, completely prepared to figure out why the plane crashed after it hits the ground.
And the regulatory impact assessment is a document showing that the seats are a standard width and the safety placards are printed in the correct font size.
Right. But in this entire multi-billion-dollar process, with thousands of people signing off on paperwork, we somehow completely skipped the wind tunnel test.
We never tested the aerodynamics.
Nobody actually built a model of the wing, put it in a wind tunnel, and tested whether the physical shape of the wing creates lift under the actual laws of aerodynamics. We are just assuming that because the materials are legal, the budget is balanced, and the fonts are correct, the plane will naturally fly.
That captures the structural void perfectly. We are skipping the wind tunnel test. And Kunis explains the institutional reason why this slot remains empty.
Why is that?
Each of these existing institutions is optimized for a very specific, different type of legitimacy. A constitutional court provides the legitimacy of legal coherence. The budget office provides the legitimacy of fiscal responsibility.
And the audit office provides retrospective accountability.
Exactly. Not a single one of them is designed to adversarially test the causal machine before political capital has been committed to installing it. And the timing here is everything.
Because once the law is passed, it's too late.
By the time a mechanism failure becomes visible in the real world, by the time the audit office catches it, the law has sunk costs. Entire government departments have been reorganized around it.
Private companies have built compliance departments to manage it.
It has owners, it has beneficiaries, and it has powerful institutional defenders who will fight tooth and nail to keep the broken machine running simply because they have adapted to it.
So we are flying blind on the actual mechanics of the laws that govern our lives. That leads us directly into Kunis's blueprint for how we actually build this wind tunnel.
How we test the aerodynamics of a piece of legislation.
Exactly. He outlines a highly specific methodology. But before we even get to the first step of the analysis, there's a strict rule he lays down. He calls it the admissibility regime. Why do we need rules about what evidence we can use?
This is perhaps the most critical safeguard in the entire framework. For a mechanism analysis to have any actual institutional authority, it cannot devolve into a partisan essay.
It can't just be an opinion piece.
Right. It cannot be infected by the moral, social, or political preferences of the analyst conducting the test. If it becomes just another opinion piece, politicians will simply dismiss it as biased.
So Kunis insists the analysis must operate under a bounded evidence set.
Yes.
What does that mean in practice? What is inside the bounds and what is out?
You are strictly restricted to the official documents provided by the legislature. You can use the bill text itself, the official explanatory memos attached to it, the fiscal tables provided by the budget office, and the official impact assessments. That's it.
Wow, so no outside research.
You cannot bring in outside academic theories about human nature, you cannot cite op-eds, and you cannot inject your own political philosophy.
But what if you see an obvious flaw based on outside knowledge?
If you see a potential failure, but you have to rely on evidence outside that official bundle to prove it, you can flag it as a hypothesis, but you cannot use it to officially close a failure readout.
It basically forces the analyst to play the game entirely on the government's own board, using only the government's pieces.
It forces the analysis to remain an objective structural computation. The analyst is essentially saying, based entirely on the words you wrote and the numbers you provided, this is what will happen.
It's about what the text actually does, structurally, rather than what anyone wishes it did politically.
Precisely.
Okay, so with the admissibility regime locking us in, we hit the first component, the mechanism claim. Kunis says this step is asking a very simple question. What does the law say will cause what?
Because most legislative drafting is surprisingly vague on causality.
Vague how?
Well, a bill will typically state a grand objective like reducing childhood poverty or increasing renewable energy adoption, and then it will list a set of new rules, taxes, or subsidies.
But the connection between the two.
The actual causal model, the mechanical bridge connecting those specific rules to that grand objective, is usually left totally implicit. The authors just assume the connection is obvious.
So the first step of the mechanism analysis is to explicitly surface that unwritten causal model and put it on paper.
The analyst has to ask, What would have to be empirically true about the world for this specific rule to produce this specific stated outcome?
What human behaviors are being assumed by the authors? What constraints are assumed to hold steady?
Exactly.
Kunis uses a term here that I think is vital for keeping this process honest. Causal steel manning.
That's a great concept.
We usually hear about steel manning in the context of debates, where you construct the absolute strongest possible version of your opponent's argument before you try to dismantle it, rather than just knocking down a weak, simplified straw man. How does steel manning apply to analyzing a law?
It's a similar principle, but Kunis draws a very sharp distinction. This isn't moral steel
All
manning.
right.
We aren't trying to make the law sound morally righteous or noble. We are causal steel manning. We are working from the proposal's strongest available mechanical reading,
Giving it the benefit of the doubt.
the maximum benefit of the doubt regarding how it intends the machinery to run. You map out the absolute best-case scenario for the causal path the authors claim exists in their text.
But why do that? Why not just immediately point out the obvious flaws?
Because if you don't steelman the mechanism first, the authors of the law will just claim you misunderstood their intent. You have to build their perfect machine on paper first.
So that when you later find a structural break in the mechanism, you are breaking their strongest possible argument.
You are proving that even under their own ideal interpretation of the text, the machine still predictably tears itself apart.
That is bulletproof. Okay, so we map out how the authors think the machine works. Then we hit the second component, the actor and response map. This is where we bring human reality into the equation, right?
Yes, the question shifts to who actually reacts to this new rule and how do they optimize?
Because whenever a law changes payoffs, introduces a new penalty, or opens a new funding channel, the actors within that system are going to react.
And the mechanism claim we just mapped out almost always assumes a very docile, compliant behavior. The response map projects what actors will actually do when faced with these new rules, assuming they act rationally to protect their own interests.
And the gap between what the law assumes people will do and what the law actually makes it rational for them to do is exactly where the machine breaks down.
That's the friction point.
Kunis introduces a really fascinating concept here regarding how people react. He calls them institutional exits or response vectors. Can we explore what happens when the cheapest way to deal with a new law isn't actually to follow it?
Absolutely. Human behavior in complex systems operates a lot like water. It flows down the path of least resistance.
Makes sense.
If a new law imposes a heavy cost, a difficult administrative burden, or a severe constraint, actors aren't just going to stand there and absorb the pressure. They will look for the cheapest available channel to relieve it.
So an institutional exit is?
An institutional exit occurs when the most efficient, rational path isn't to comply with the new rule within the law's intended domain, but to exit that domain entirely and shift the burden to a neighboring system.
I'd love a concrete example of an exit like that.
Let's imagine a government decides it needs to dramatically reduce its welfare budget, specifically targeting unemployment benefits.
Okay.
They pass a law with incredibly strict new eligibility requirements. The formal goal is to get people off unemployment and into the workforce.
So make it harder to be unemployed so they get a job?
Right. And the formal system might look like it's working initially because the number of people on unemployment drops. But the response map would show that the cheapest rational move for many of those individuals, especially those with chronic health issues or borderline unemployability, isn't to magically find a job that doesn't exist.
What is it then?
The cheapest rational move is to seek a medical diagnosis and exit the unemployment system into the healthcare-funded disability system.
Wow, so they haven't stopped needing financial support. They've just changed the label on the support.
They've dumped the cost onto a neighboring system. The unemployment budget looks great, but the healthcare disability budget suddenly skyrockets.
The pressure simply routed itself through the cheapest available unmodeled channel. Let me pause here because I can hear someone listening to this and feeling a bit of friction with the underlying assumption. Is this approach just fundamentally cynical?
It can sound that way.
It feels like the mechanism analysis assumes every single actor, whether that's a citizen, small business owner, a local mayor, or a doctor, is just this cold, calculating sociopath constantly looking for the easiest loophole or the fastest exit. Don't most people generally just follow the rules because it's the right thing to do?
It is a really common reaction to feel that this sounds cynical, but the mechanism analysis isn't assuming malice at all. It is mapping rational optimization within constraints.
Right.
Most people are generally just trying to survive, maintain their small businesses, protect their families' livelihoods, and do their jobs efficiently given the rules they operate under. When a legislature changes the rules of the game, they change what constitutes a rational, survival-oriented choice.
So it's not about people being evil. It's about people responding to the environment the law just created.
Consider a regulation that introduces massive, ruinous compliance costs, specifically for companies with 500 or more employees. A perfectly honest business owner with 500 employees realizes this new rule will bankrupt them.
So they have to react.
The rational response isn't to accept bankruptcy. The rational response is to legally split the company into two 249 employee companies.
Which technically means they don't have to comply.
That isn't cynical evasion. That is the structure of the law actively dictating the physical shape of reality. Relying on the spirit of the law to overcome massive structural financial incentives is exactly why these mechanisms fail.
You can't just hope for the best.
You cannot engineer a suspension bridge and just hope the wind decides to blow gently because it would be in the spirit of the bridge.
Right.
You have to engineer for the structural realities of gravity and gale force winds.
That is a brilliant way to frame it. You have to design the law for the gravity of human incentives. Which brings us to the third component, and this might be my favorite concept in the entire essay, the hidden ledger. Kunis talks about the illusion of the clean target. What happens when a law's formal, on-paper target looks absolutely perfect, but the reality on the ground is a disaster?
This is a profound structural insight. Any mechanism is going to be wired to protect its formal target above all else.
Okay, give me an example.
If a law mandates that a government agency must operate with a zero deficit, the entire mechanism of that agency will force decisions designed specifically to protect that zero deficit metric.
Because that's what they're being measured on.
Well, on paper, when the audit comes in, the target might look pristine, the spreadsheet is green, but the actual pressure, the physical and human cost of achieving that target doesn't just magically disappear. It has to be absorbed somewhere in the system.
And Kunis calls this the absorption ledger. He says there are hidden stocks of value that secretly bear the cost of hitting these artificial targets.
What kind of stocks are we talking about here? We are talking about critical, non-financial variables that don't easily fit into a budget office spreadsheet. Things like administrative capacity, human capital, institutional trust, future optionality, and the baseline quality of a public service.
These are the hidden ledgers.
Yes.
So if that agency is forced to meet a zero deficit target, they might achieve it, but how?
They might achieve it by freezing all hiring for 2 years, canceling all software upgrades, and forcing their current staff to do triple the work using failing equipment.
Which sounds miserable.
The formal indicator, the budget, looks fine, but the cost was absorbed off balance sheet. It was absorbed by consuming the hidden stock of staff sanity, by accumulating deferred maintenance, and by burning through the institutional trust of the public who now have to wait 6 months for a basic permit.
This reminds me so much of corporate life. If you've ever worked in a large organization, you've seen this.
Oh, definitely.
Imagine a middle manager who is given a brutal quarterly efficiency target. Their bonus depends on it. So they hit that target, and their specific spreadsheet looks amazing when they present it to the CEO.
But how do they get there?
Exactly. The way they hit it was by forcing their entire team to work 80-hour weeks for 3 months straight, canceling everyone's vacations, and creating a totally toxic environment. The formal indicator looks fantastic, but the hidden stock of employee sanity, loyalty, and health is completely drained.
And we know what happens next.
Right. The entire team quits a month later, and the company spends 10 times the money they saved just trying to recruit and train replacements.
That captures the dynamic perfectly. And Kunis introduces a principle here called full accounting.
What does that entail?
Full accounting means the mechanism analysis refuses to book that employee burnout at zero simply because it is hard to put into a financial column. As Kunis writes, hard to measure is not the same as zero.
I love that quote.
The mechanism analysis demands that we track these hidden variables. If you meet a target by silently consuming an untracked stock, you haven't actually achieved efficiency. You've just engaged in structural accounting fraud.
Kunis also introduces an engineering term regarding these stocks: hysteresis. Why is this concept so crucial when we talk about destroying versus rebuilding these hidden stocks of value?
Hysteresis originally describes a physical property, like in magnetic fields, where the state of a system depends on its history.
Okay.
It describes a profound asymmetry between the speed of destruction and the speed of rebuilding. Kunis uses it as the severity tiebreaker in the mechanism analysis. Some stocks in society are highly reversible.
Like what?
If a legislature passes a law that cuts funding to a parks department by 10%, that's bad, but it lacks hysteresis. You can usually fix it the very next year by just passing a new budget and adding the 10% back.
The grass grows back.
The grass grows back. But other stocks are functionally irreversible on normal policy timescales.
Give me an example of an irreversible stock.
If you burn out your specialized administrative staff and they all quit, you haven't just lost workers. You have severed a training pipeline and lost tacit knowledge, the unwritten understanding of how the system actually runs. That might take a decade to rebuild.
Wow.
If you pass a law that destroys institutional trust in a marginalized community, you cannot simply pass a new law next year to reinstate that trust. It might take a generation to recover.
Demographic collapse, accumulated distrust, lost tacit knowledge.
Exactly. These are incredibly fast to destroy and agonizingly slow to rebuild. A reversible budget cut of $10 million and an irreversible destruction of institutional capacity worth $10 million might both carry the exact same numeric value in a fiscal score, but they're categorically different structural failures. The mechanism analysis forces us to treat them differently.
We are looking at the long-term irreversible damage to the system itself. But that raises a big question. How does the analyst decide which hidden stocks are important enough to track?
That's a fair question.
Because if we have an admissibility regime that prevents political bias, isn't deciding what counts as a valuable stock inherently political?
Kunis anticipates this. He defines a single, non-arbitrary, empirical objective function for the analysis: long-term civilizational adaptive capacity.
That is a hefty phrase. Long-term civilizational adaptive capacity. What does that actually mean on the ground?
It refers to the fundamental structural substrate that allows any society to survive and flourish over time. A society needs a safety margin.
To handle shocks.
Exactly. It needs the capacity to adapt to sudden crises, whether that's a pandemic, an economic shock, or a natural disaster. Inclusion on the hidden ledger is treated as a strictly empirical question. Does depleting this specific stock measurably degrade the society's physical ability to adapt and survive over a long horizon?
So it's not about whether the analyst likes parks or hates taxes. It's about whether the system is being structurally weakened.
If a new bill maximizes a short-term proxy target, but the response map shows it will predictably deplete a load-bearing stock of civilizational capacity, like the supply of trained medical personnel or the integrity of the judicial system, the mechanism analysis acts like a software compiler warning.
Flagging the issue.
It flags the conflict permanently on the record. It says, the code compiles, the target is met, but the system will eventually crash.
Let's transition into the actual crashes.
Yeah.
We've mapped the mechanism, we've tracked the human responses, and we've accounted for the hidden ledgers. The fourth component is diagnosing the failure modes. This is where Kunis provides a taxonomy.
Right. He lists the specific, predictable ways these causal machines break down.
This is where the mechanism analysis transitions from being a descriptive map into a true diagnostic tool. We aren't just looking at a bill and saying, this is bad. We are giving the legislation a specific, typed structural diagnosis, the way a doctor diagnoses an illness.
Kunis outlines several major types of mechanism failure.
I find this fascinating. It's like having a medical chart for bad laws. You don't just say the patient is sick. You say, looking at your vitals, you have a severe case of proxy-target divergence, complicated by a missing destination. Let's walk through this taxonomy in detail. The first one is the soft budget constraint. What does that look like in practice?
The concept of the soft budget constraint originates with the Hungarian economist János Kornai, who studied socialist economies. A soft budget constraint occurs when an economic actor knows structurally that they will ultimately be rescued or bailed out by a parent entity if they fail.
So there's no real risk.
Because they know the parent entity, say, the central federal government cannot politically or legally allow them to collapse, efficiency is never actually rewarded, and risk is never truly penalized.
Can you give an example of how a law creates this?
Imagine a law governing subordinate local municipalities. The law says local mayors are responsible for their budgets, but another overarching law guarantees that the state will maintain basic services no matter what.
So the schools won't close even if the mayor goes broke.
Right. If a local mayor runs a massive deficit by handing out lucrative contracts to friends, the state quietly steps in and covers the shortfall to keep the schools open.
So the mayor suffers no structural consequence.
The mechanism itself guarantees continuous, escalating deficits because producing a surplus offers no reward, while running a deficit carries no fatal penalty.
Next on the taxonomy is proxy target divergence. I feel like Anyone who has worked in modern education or healthcare has felt the pain of this one.
It is ubiquitous. This is closely related to Goodhart's law and Campbell's law. It occurs when a mechanism takes a measured proxy and optimizes it at the direct expense of the real-world target it was supposed to represent.
Like standardized testing in schools.
A perfect example.
Mhm.
The true target is comprehensive childhood education. The proxy target is a math score on a standardized test.
Right.
If a law ties massive financial funding or school survival entirely to the proxy target, the rational response of the school is to cut art, cut music, cut recess, and spend 6 hours a day teaching kids the specific tricks to pass the math test.
The proxy target is maximized. The scores go up. But the underlying true target, a well-rounded education, is actively destroyed.
The same happens in hospitals if funding is tied to patient coding. The rational response is to upcode the severity of illnesses. The population looks sicker on paper, maximizing revenue, but clinical health hasn't changed.
Then we have response routed through unmodeled channel. We touched on this earlier with the business owner, but let's formalize it.
This is when actors technically comply with the letter of the rule, but they do so via a path the legislative proposal never anticipated, neutralizing the intended effect.
Splitting the 500-person firm into 249-person firms to dodge the regulatory threshold.
Precisely. They complied with the law. Neither firm has 500 employees. But the policy goal of regulating large enterprises was completely bypassed through an unmodeled channel.
Which flows directly into institutional exit.
An institutional exit is a more extreme version. The cost of compliance within the law's domain is so high that actors completely escape the system and shift the cost elsewhere.
Like the unemployment example.
Yes, we discussed the example of tightening unemployment rules and pushing everyone onto medical disability. The pressure leaves the targeted system entirely.
What about missing destination? This one sounds like pure Kafkaesque bureaucratic nightmare fuel.
It is the definition of a bureaucratic void. A missing destination mechanism is a rule that requires an immense amount of action, data collection, or output to be generated, but legally assigns absolutely no one to receive it, review it, or act on it.
So a law mandates that every local water agency must produce a highly detailed 500-page environmental impact report every single year. The local agencies spend millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours producing these massive binders.
But the law assigned no one at the Federal Environmental Agency the legal obligation, the funding, or the staff to actually read them.
So they just sit there.
The binders are mailed to a warehouse and gather dust. The mechanism generates massive costly friction that flows into an absolute void. It achieves nothing but the consumption of resources.
Then we have sequencing violation.
This is a fundamental failure of time and logic. A sequencing violation occurs when stage 2 of a process logically and physically requires stage 1 to already exist, but the law legally mandates stage 2 to be executed first.
How does that happen?
Poor drafting. For instance, a new law places a strict legal obligation on rural clinics to provide a highly specialized new medical screening starting on January 1st.
Oh.
But the separate funding mechanism that provides the money to buy the machines and train the specialized personnel required for that screening doesn't legally unlock until July 1st.
That's a mess.
The mechanism is logically impossible to execute without forcing the clinics to either break the law or go bankrupt.
And finally, we have threshold mismatch.
This is the danger of arbitrary hard cutoffs that completely ignore operational reality.
Like the 500-employee rule.
Setting a harsh regulatory threshold at exactly 500 employees. The mechanism structurally treats a firm with 3 employees and a firm with 499 employees as exactly the same kind of entity, while treating a firm with 499 employees and a firm with 500 employees as completely alien to one another.
It forces reality to fit an arbitrary mathematical step function.
Exactly.
Kunis notes that when an analyst applies these diagnoses, they are required to use something called confidence typing. Why is it so important to type our confidence in these predictions?
Because conflating confidence levels destroys the credibility of the entire analysis. Kunis demands that predictions be explicitly typed, so politicians know exactly what is a certainty and what is a guess.
Okay, what's high confidence?
Mechanism logic carries high confidence. We know the direction of behavior because the incentive structure is undeniable. If you tax something heavily, people will generally try to do less of it. That is high confidence.
What is medium confidence?
Structural prediction. This is how multiple mechanisms might interact with each other. It's highly likely, but involves more variables.
And low confidence?
Quantitative magnitude. Guessing exactly how many people will take the exit or exactly how many millions of dollars will be lost.
That makes sense.
The analysis must be brutally honest. It must state, "We know with high confidence that this incentive structure makes fraud rational, but we have low confidence on exactly how many dollars will be defrauded without running a separate, massive empirical model." It separates structural certainty from numerical guesswork.
Okay, we have the theory, we have the admissibility rules, we have the diagnostic taxonomy. It's time to step into the graveyard. The fifth section of the essay is where Kunis takes this framework and applies it retroactively to real-world disasters across different countries.
And it is a vast, tragic graveyard of untested mechanisms.
I think the most powerful way to understand this is to walk through these case studies. We are going to look at failures from multiple different jurisdictions, and we're going to look at them neutrally, focusing entirely on the mechanical, structural failures of the policies rather than the politics surrounding them.
A good approach.
Let's start with case one. The UK Post Office Horizon scandal. This has recently gotten a lot of attention, and it is widely considered one of the most devastating miscarriages of justice in British history.
It is a harrowing story. For context, the UK Post Office is a massive institution, but many of the local branches are run by independent franchisees, sub-postmasters.
And the Post Office ruled out a massive new centralized IT system called Horizon to handle the accounting. But the system was deeply flawed. It was generating phantom shortfalls, making it look like these local postmasters were stealing tens of thousands of pounds.
That is the technical failure, but the mechanism failure, the reason it became a human tragedy, lies in the legal structure.
How so?
The existing government oversight looked at the procurement delays and the budget of the IT system. But mechanism analysis would have mapped the actors and the unique powers granted by the legal framework.
What were those powers?
The mechanism granted a highly autonomous corporate body, the Post Office unchecked private prosecutorial power.
Wait, they could prosecute their own employees?
They did not need to go through the independent police to prosecute their franchisees. Simultaneously, the mechanism gave the Post Office operational responsibility for an incredibly expensive, politically sensitive IT system.
So the Post Office was the victim of the supposed theft. They were the investigators of the theft, and they were the prosecutors. And their own IT system was the only witness.
Yes. A mechanism analysis would have immediately diagnosed a catastrophic principal-agent distortion. When the Horizon IT system began producing massive errors, the executives at the Post Office faced a choice.
Admit the system was broken.
They could admit their multi-million-pound IT system was broken, which would damage their careers and the institution's reputation. Or they could use their unchecked prosecutorial power to blame the franchisees and recover the phantom money.
That's horrifying.
The cheapest, most rational institutional exit to defend the ID investment was to prosecute the innocent postmasters. The structure made wrongful prosecution practically inevitable. Over 900 wrongful convictions, massive financial ruin, people sent to prison, and multiple suicides. The mechanism operated exactly as its incentives dictated.
That is absolutely chilling. It wasn't just a glitch. The law armed the glitch with prosecutorial power. Case 2 is the Australian robo-debt scandal, another system that destroyed thousands of lives. What was the mechanism failure here?
This was officially called the Online Compliance Intervention Scheme. The mechanism was designed to automatically identify welfare overpayments. The system wanted to catch people who were underreporting their income while claiming benefits.
Seemed like a standard administrative goal. How did the mechanism try to achieve it?
It took annual tax data from the Australian Taxation Office, how much a person made in an entire year, and it averaged that annual number across 26 fortnightly welfare reporting periods.
Wait, that makes no mathematical sense. People's income fluctuates. If I work retail, I might make all my money during the holiday season and be unemployed for 3 months in the summer.
Exactly.
You can't just take an annual average, divide it evenly across the whole year, and apply it to a specific 2-week period in July to prove I lied about my income in July.
You are absolutely right. It is mathematically and legally invalid for an episodic statutory entitlement. The assumption of uniform income distribution over a year is structurally incompatible with the reality of precarious seasonal work.
So how did it pass?
The cabinet review process didn't require attached legal advice verifying the structural authority for the averaging method. A pre-enactment mechanism analysis would have flagged this immediately as a fatal threshold mismatch.
The core mechanism, the data matching algorithm, was fundamentally incompatible with physical reality.
The result was massive, automated debt notices sent to vulnerable people who owed nothing. It caused profound human trauma and resulted in over $1.2 billion in class action settlements.
Let's move to the United States. Case 3 looks at the Affordable Care Act, specifically the rollout of the state exchanges and the tax subsidies.
The drafting of the ACA assumed a framework of cooperative federalism. The mechanism was designed with the assumption that individual state governments would voluntarily build and manage their own health insurance exchanges.
But Curtis points out that an actor response map would have caught a glaring flaw in that assumption.
If you mapped the political actors, you would have seen that the incentives for many state governors were entirely unaligned with the federal mechanism. The analysis would have predicted massive partisan opt-outs.
And that is exactly what happened.
Over 30 states simply refused to build the exchanges, which pushed millions of users onto the federal fallback system, contributing to its initial collapse.
And what about the tax credits? There was a mechanism failure there as well.
Yes, the advanced tax credit disbursement architecture. The system paid subsidies to insurers based on unverified, self-reported income from the applicants at the time of enrollment.
Unverified.
There was no upfront mechanism for friction against misreporting. The mechanism made it entirely rational to simply invent or underestimate income figures to secure a larger tax credit, knowing the IRS reconciliation wouldn't happen until a year later.
So people just gamed it.
Later investigations found billions of dollars in unreconciled tax credits because the mechanism lacked a basic verification primitive at the point of entry.
Case 4 is also in the U.S. The 1996 Welfare Reform Act, often known as PR-WARA. This is a fascinating look at how proxy targets can warp reality.
This is a classic hidden ledger and proxy target divergence failure. The stated goal of the legislation was to reduce poverty and encourage work.
Okay.
The mechanism it used was to change how the federal government funded state welfare programs. It decoupled the federal block grants from actual observed poverty rates and instead tied the funding and the penalties to caseload reduction.
The proxy target was reducing the sheer number of people on the welfare rolls.
Exactly. So what was the rational response for the states? If a state gets to keep the federal block grant money and avoid penalties as long as their total caseload drops, the cheapest response is not to actually lift people out of poverty.
Because solving systemic poverty is incredibly expensive, difficult, and takes years.
The cheapest, fastest, most rational response is revenue extraction by administrative attrition.
Meaning you just make it too hard to stay on welfare.
You make the paperwork incredibly opaque. You introduce punitive requirements. You require in-person meetings at inconvenient hours. You create a system so full of friction that people simply give up and are kicked off the rolls.
That's heartbreaking.
The states succeeded spectacularly in the proxy target. Welfare caseloads plummeted across the country, but they failed the underlying true target. Extreme disconnected poverty actually rose, while states quietly diverted the federal welfare funds to plug other holes in their state budgets.
The mechanism rewarded administrative attrition, not human elevation.
Correct.
Case 5 takes us to Europe. The EU Common Agricultural Policy Reforms in 2003.
The single payment scheme. The EU decided they wanted to reduce overproduction. They didn't want mountains of surplus butter and lakes of surplus wine, so they decoupled agricultural subsidy payments from actual crop production volume.
What do they tie it to instead?
Instead, they moved to area-based payments. You get paid based on how much agricultural land you maintain.
What could possibly go wrong with paying people just to own land?
Basic economic rent theory takes over. A mechanism analysis would have shown that these decoupled payments mechanically capitalize directly into land rents.
How so?
Because the statutory definitions of what constituted agricultural activity or keeping land in good agricultural condition were necessarily vague, regulatory arbitrage was structurally guaranteed.
People found the unmodeled exit.
The payments flowed to anyone who owned land that technically qualified, regardless of whether they were farmers. Golf courses, railway companies, aristocratic estates, and massive real estate holding firms suddenly received agricultural subsidies simply for mowing the grass.
Unbelievable.
And worse, because the subsidy was attached to the land, it artificially inflated land prices across Europe, which ended up pricing young, actual working farmers completely out of the market. The mechanism rewarded land ownership, not agriculture.
And finally, Case 6, the Northern Ireland Protocol, which was part of the Brexit withdrawal agreement.
This represents a pure structural trilemma. The peace in Northern Ireland, underpinned by the Good Friday Agreement, rests on incredibly delicate, interlocking relationships.
North-South cooperation on the island, East-West integration with Great Britain, and internal cross-community consent.
But the Brexit protocol had to draw a customs border somewhere.
Right.
The protocol's mechanism tried to secure an open north-south border by placing an economic customs border in the Irish Sea, effectively severing the frictionless east-west ties between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK.
And why is that a structural failure?
A causal reconstruction prior to signing would have shown that the mechanism was a logical impossibility. You cannot structurally sever the east-west economic link without inevitably violating the cross-community consent principle that requires unionist support.
It was a machine designed to tear itself apart.
The parliamentary scrutiny in the UK was heavily fast-tracked under intense political pressure to get Brexit done. They skipped the structural wind tunnel test.
And the result?
The entirely foreseeable result was the multi-year collapse of the Stormont executive, the local government in Northern Ireland, and a forced, painful renegotiation years later.
What strikes me most, listening to you walk through all 6 of these cases, from welfare to agriculture to international treaties, is that absolutely none of these were unpredictable acts of God.
Not a single one. Every failure was contained right there in the blueprints.
They didn't fail because of bad luck or a sudden shift in the weather. They failed along the exact predictable pathways that their own internal mechanisms made rational.
Exactly.
If we had run Kunis's test bench, if we had simply mapped the actors, checked the hidden ledgers, and typed the failure modes, we would have seen every single one of these crashes coming before the laws were ever signed.
That is the tragedy of retrospective audits, and it is the entire promise of the mechanism analysis.
That sets us up perfectly to do a deep dive inside our deep dive. Kunis doesn't just list historical failures. He provides a highly detailed, comprehensive worked example in his essay.
Yes, the Finnish welfare example.
He applies the full mechanism analysis to the Finnish welfare system, specifically a proposed 2025 funding amendment. Let's set the scene here. What is the architecture of the Finnish system?
In 2023, Finland underwent a massive reorganization of its health and social services. They created 21 distinct welfare regions across the country, plus the capital city of Helsinki.
Okay, 21 regions.
These 21 regions were given massive constitutional statutory obligations. They are legally required to provide health care, rescue services, and social care to the population.
Okay, so they have the legal burden to provide the services. But how do they actually pay the doctors and buy the ambulances?
That is the critical structural flaw in the architecture. These 21 regions have absolutely no independent taxing authority.
Wait, none.
They cannot raise their own local revenues to cover their costs. The central state government is the sole funder. And crucially, because these services are constitutionally mandated, the central state is the ultimate payer of last resort.
Meaning the state has to step in.
The central government cannot legally or politically allow any of these 21 regions to go bankrupt and shut down their emergency rooms.
So we have a massive, systemic, soft budget constraint baked right into the foundation.
Yeah.
The regions know they can't be allowed to fail.
Exactly. Now, enter the 2025 funding amendment. The central government looked at the system and realized it was costing too much. They proposed a bill to cut some of the transition funding adjustments.
Who were they cutting from?
Specifically, the cut targeted Helsinki because Helsinki had actually managed to produce a budget surplus.
Ah, I see where this is going.
The Ministry of Finance framed this in their explanatory memos as a temporary technical savings measure that wouldn't endanger patient services, pointing out that Helsinki had surplus money anyway, so it was a victimless cut.
Okay, let's run Kunis's test bench on this. If I'm a rational actor, say I'm the director of one of those other 21 welfare regions, what does this new rule actually teach me about how to survive? You observe the causal rule in action. You see that if a region works hard, innovates, and produces a budget surplus by being efficient, the state sees that visible surplus and immediately applies a targeted legislative cut to confiscate it.
And if they fail?
But because of the soft budget constraint, if a region produces a massive deficit by overspending, the state is forced to cover the shortfall because the hospitals must stay open. Therefore, the rational, survival-oriented response for every single regional director is to ensure they never, ever produce a visible surplus.
This is wild.
Yeah.
Let me give you an analogy to make sure the structural incentive is totally clear.
Let's hear it.
Imagine a teenager who gets a weekly allowance. They decide they want to buy a bicycle, so they start being frugal. They pack their lunches, they stop buying sodas, and they save up $50 in a piggy bank in their room.
Okay.
But then the parents walk in, look at the piggy bank, and say, "Oh, you have surplus cash. Clearly, we are giving you too much allowance. We are cutting your weekly allowance starting next week."
What is the behavioral lesson the teenager learns? The teenager learns instantly. Never save a dime. Spend every single cent the moment it touches your hand on whatever you can find. Hide your efficiency, because visible efficiency simply invites confiscation. The rule actively shapes the behavior, regardless of how the parents try to justify or label it.
That is precisely the dynamic Kunis highlights regarding the label. The Finnish government called the cut a technical correction of historical overfunding, but the mechanism analysis strips away the political label.
It doesn't matter what they call it.
It says, the label does not change the structural rule. Technical correction and punitive confiscation are just two different political labels for the exact same causal machine. Surplus produced equals funding cut applied. The structural rule shapes future behavior. The political label does not.
And what about the hidden ledger here? Where does the actual cost get absorbed?
The formal target, the central government's fiscal spreadsheet, looks fine on paper for the 2025 budget. They saved some millions by cutting Helsinki's funding. But the pressure is absorbed entirely off balance sheet.
Because the other regions stop trying to be efficient.
Because all 21 regions are now structurally disincentivized from pursuing efficiency and are forced into a permanent game of fiscal chicken with the state to prove they need more money, you see the rapid depletion of the hidden stocks.
Like preventive care.
You see the depletion of preventive care because it's cheaper to let a patient get sick and treat them in the emergency room than to fund long-term prevention. You see massive administrative burnout.
And a loss of trust.
You see a complete erosion of institutional trust between the regions and the central government. And eventually you see the accumulation of massive downstream bailout pressure that will eventually hit the central state budget anyway.
It's a perfectly diagnosed cascading failure. So we've put the law in the wind tunnel and the wings fell off. We found the broken part in the engine. What do we do now? We move to the final piece of the puzzle, component 5 and the repair override loop. How do we actually fix the broken machine?
Kunis draws on an incredibly strong engineering precedent here. He references the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration in the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
When an aviation component fails in a commercial jet, engineers don't just write a critique, publish a paper about it, and put the broken part back in the plane. The FAA issues a highly specific repair specification. You must execute this specific repair before the component is allowed back into service.
So Kunis adapts this for laws.
He adapts this into a 6-field repair specification for legislation.
Let's run through these 6 fields and let's keep using the Finnish welfare example to ground it.
Field 1 is identifying the missing primitive. What is the absolute smallest institutional capability that is missing from the machine?
What's the primitive here?
In the Finnish case, the missing primitive is a shared surplus reserve, a statutory rule stating that if a region is efficient, they get to keep a legally protected percentage of their surplus to invest in their own local capacity, immune from state clawbacks.
Nice. Field 2.
Field 2 is the owner, who holds this capability, the regional authority, acting with statutory protection.
And Field 3 is the trigger.
When do they get to act? Upon the production and audit of a verified fiscal surplus.
Field 4 is really interesting. The wrong repair warning.
Yes. What is the attractive, politically expedient, but ultimately destructive intervention that the system will default to if we aren't careful?
The lazy fix.
In this case, the warning is, do not attempt to force efficiency by applying targeted penalties on surplus-producing regions. That just deepens the soft budget constraint and teaches them to hide money.
Field 5 is the movement test.
This is about falsifiability. The analysis must be willing to be proven wrong. What observation in the real world would prove that our mechanism analysis was incorrect?
How do you test that?
The test states, if the government passes the cut without the shared surplus repair, we predict regions will reduce their surplus capacity within 2 budget cycles and aggregate national deficits will rise. We set a review window, say, the publication of the 2027 fiscal report, to empirically check our prediction.
And finally, Field 6, constraint analysis.
Can we actually fix this legally right now? The shared surplus reserve rule could be amended into the current Finance Act. But the analyst also notes that the deeper architectural fix giving the region's actual constitutional taxing authority would require a massive constitutional amendment, which is beyond the scope of this single bill.
Okay, so the analyst generates this comprehensive 6-field repair spec and hands it to the politicians. But here is the crucial political point, and really the heart of the entire essay. Kunis states emphatically that the mechanism analysis is not a veto.
It is absolutely not a veto. It does not give unelected technocrats, analysts, or auditors a veto over democratic sovereignty. The legislature remains supreme.
So we enter what he calls the loop. A politician proposes a mechanism. The analysis tests it, finds a failure, and produces the repair spec. Now, the legislature has four distinct choices. They can fix the bill using the repair spec, they can narrow their claims about what the bill will achieve, they can fundamentally change their target, or they can override.
The override is the stroke of genius in this framework. The beauty of the override is that it is always legally available, but it is never politically silent.
Right.
The legislature has the absolute democratic right to ignore the analysis and pass a broken law. But to override the analysis, the minister or the committee chair must publicly accept the broken assumptions on the permanent record.
So they have to own it.
They have to literally sign their names to a document acknowledging that they are installing a mechanism that has been explicitly typed as structurally failing.
Let me push back on this, because this is where the rubber meets the road in real politics. If the political field is completely captured by special interests, or if the politicians are just deeply cynical and don't care about structural reality because they only care about the next election, won't they just confidently sign the override and pass the broken law anyway?
It's a real concern.
Does this actually stop bad laws from happening, or does it just give us really high-quality autopsies after the plane crashes?
That is the ultimate test of the system. And Kunis addresses this directly, discussing what he calls trapped equilibria. He acknowledges that, yes, sometimes politicians actually want a broken mechanism.
Why would they want that?
A complex, failing law can distribute quiet rents to favored groups, it can maintain a fragile political coalition, or it can punish political enemies. In a highly captured or cynical system, they absolutely will sign the override and pass the bad law.
So if they just sign it anyway, what's the point of doing all this work?
The point is legibility. Right now, in our current system, when a law fails catastrophically, politicians get to hide behind the shield of plausible deniability.
They act shocked.
They get to throw their hands up in front of the cameras and say, who could have possibly known this welfare reform would hurt people? It was a noble intention. The implementation was just flawed.
Right.
The mechanism analysis completely strips away that plausible deniability. It trades substantive veto power for absolute undeniable legibility. By forcing the structural costs and the predictable failures out into the open before the vote, it creates a durable, legally binding focal point for future challengers.
It puts it on the permanent record.
Exactly. 5 years later, when the system collapses, a journalist, a rival politician, or a citizen watchdog group can pull up the override document and say, you don't get to pretend this was an accident. You were told exactly how this would fail. You were given the repair specification. You signed a document accepting that failure, and you chose to do it anyway.
That's incredible.
It fundamentally changes the political cost of bad architecture. It stops them from pretending the break was an unforeseen act of God. That is incredibly powerful for democratic accountability.
We are coming to the end of our deep dive into Elias Kunis's The Mechanism analysis. Let's briefly recap the journey we've been on. We started with the realization that laws are not just words on a page, they are active, causal machines.
Yep.
We looked at the empty slot in our modern oversight, how we have armies of lawyers checking for constitutionality and armies of accountants checking the budget, but we have no one testing if the machine actually works.
The missing wind tunnel.
We explored the rigorous blueprint for that test bench, demanding a bounded evidence set, mapping rational human actors, tracking the hidden ledgers of institutional trust and capacity, diagnosing specific failure modes like soft budget constraints and missing destinations, and finally, forcing a public repair or override loop.
It is a profound shift in perspective. It moves us away from endlessly arguing about the moral intentions of a policy, which is where most political debate is stuck, and moves us toward computationally testing the structural reality of its execution.
Which is much more objective.
We can stop being surprised when poorly designed systems crash, because we now have the vocabulary and the tools to see the failure before we ever turn the machine on.
If you've ever dealt with a homeowners association rule that created neighborhood warfare, or a corporate HR policy that made your job actively harder while claiming to boost productivity, I encourage you to take this framework into your own life.
It applies everywhere.
Stop looking at the rules around you based on what the author intended to happen. Start looking at them through Kunis's lens. What does this mechanism actually make rational for people to do? Where are the institutional exits? What hidden stocks of your own sanity or trust are being absorbed just to keep the compliance spreadsheet looking green?
Once you start seeing the causal machinery underlying the rules in your life, You can never unsee it. You become structurally literate.
You realize that a failed policy, whether in a corporation or a country, is not mysterious. It fails along the exact path its mechanism made rational.
Absolutely.
Which brings me to a final provocative thought. Something that builds on Kunis's work, but points toward a very wild future that is approaching faster than we think. We are currently entering an era where artificial intelligence is beginning to assist in drafting legal language, writing contracts, and managing corporate compliance.
This is a huge shift.
Now, if Kunis is right, if a law is fundamentally a machine or a piece of code that can be computationally tested against a bounded evidence set, then we are looking at the exact type of task that an advanced AI compiler could absolutely excel at.
That is a fascinating extrapolation. AI struggles with moral ambiguity, but it excels at mapping complex, branching logic trees.
Imagine a near future where every single piece of proposed legislation, every municipal zoning ordinance, every corporate mandate is instantly run through thousands of simulated actor response maps by an AI before a politician even picks up a pen to sign it.
It would be instant feedback.
The AI instantly surfaces the hidden ledgers, it types the failure modes in milliseconds, and it spits out the six-field repair specification. The mechanism analysis might not just be a new bureaucratic document for human oversight. It might actually be the foundational blueprint for the first automated legislative immune system.
It would force a level of structural legibility that human politics currently resists with all its might. If the machine can mathematically prove the law is broken before it's passed, the space for political plausible deniability shrinks to zero.
I want to leave you pondering that. How might technology eventually enforce the very structural honesty that we struggle to maintain in governance today? Remember our opening thought. We would never build a multi-billion-dollar passenger jet and skip the wind tunnel test. It's time we stop skipping the wind tunnel test for the laws that govern our lives. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Kunis's mechanism analysis. We'll see you next time.